It's my pleasure to have my friend and the president of PRRI and one of the country's leading authorities on religion and politics, Robert P. Jones, join us. Welcome, Robbie.
Hi, Jen. Great to be here.
It is indeed great to get a chance to chat with you. PRRI just released an enormous survey on white Christian nationalism. 22,000 or so Americans surveyed, which is almost
Indeed.
unheard of. Tell us, first of all, what white Christian nationalism is, and secondly, some of the more important findings from the survey that you did.
Yeah. Well, I'll start by just saying, we have this term, white Christian nationalism, which is a relatively new term in the last 5, 6, 7 years that we've seen it being used in the vernacular, but it's actually a new term for a very old phenomenon. And the thing that has always been in competition with the American ideals of um, a pluralistic democracy is a competing view that this country was set aside by God as a kind of promised land for European Christians, right? And these two visions have really been struggling, right, throughout our history. So when we talk about white Christian nationalism today, it is the contemporary outgrowth of this very, very old tradition that has kind of been in a struggle, life and death struggle, really, with the competing vision for a pluralistic democracy. But today, when we measure it, we have this new study and we have to measure it because it's a scientific study. And we're measuring it with questions that, you'll recognize that are really about Christian domination of the country and in a very hierarchical view where white Christians are at the top and everybody else is somewhere below that. So we measure it with questions like, U.S. law should be based on Christian values. God has called Christians to exercise dominion over all areas of American society. The U.S. government should declare America a Christian nation, and so forth. We use 5 separate questions and combine those questions together. And essentially, we do that. We find today that about 3 in 10 Americans are sympathetic to this worldview. They are either adherents. About 10% of Americans are full-on adherents. That is, they completely agree with nearly every question in the scale, and another 20% of Americans, an additional 20%, are Christian nationalism sympathizers who agree, maybe not completely, but they agree with those statements in general. So it's a little bit less than a third of the country that agrees with that. The good news is it's 2/3 of the country that reject this view.
Unfortunately, the third that hold these views essentially have come to dominate one political party, which has created a lock not only on the courts, but on other parts of our government. Explain the overlap between white Christian nationalism, MAGA, and the Republican Party. Are we essentially talking about the same people?
Well, really, it's a great question. Really, very, very heavy overlap. And like one of the easiest ways to see it in our new study is that because we had 22,000 interviews, we could go all the way down to the state level. We could look at every state in the country. And one of the most striking charts that we have in the new report is that we actually correlated Trump vote in support for Trump had in every state, and on the y-axis and on the x-axis, we put support for Christian nationalism in that state. And if you were writing a statistics textbook and you wanted an example of like a nearly perfect linear correlation, this
Mm.
chart would be it. In other words,
Wow.
the higher the state scores on residents supporting Christian nationalism, the more likely they were to support Trump. And it's every state across the country, just very nearly aligned along a linear a trend line. So these things are very tightly coordinated there. And just to be very specific about it, white evangelical Protestants, right, who are the very core of Trump's base, who voted for him more than 80%. In every time he's been on the ballot, by the way, not just this last time, but every time he's been on the ballot, that group is 2/3 either Christian nationalism adherents or sympathizers. So they're pretty much all in. And even among all Republicans, it's now a majority of Republicans who are either Christian nationalism adherents or sympathizers. And if you look at the composition of the Republican Party today, this is also fairly striking. So the country overall has, as you know, become more and more diverse, right? So the country is only about 4 in 10 white and Christian, even if you put all white Christians together. But the Republican Party is 7 in 10 white and Christian. So essentially, what we've got now is a kind of MAGA controlled majority white Christian party that's become a Christian nationalist party under Trump's leadership.
And because of certain embedded features of our Constitution, like giving disproportionate weight to rural red states, they have
Yeah.
disproportionate power in our government. Some of the items that you asked are deeply disturbing. A rationalization for violence, for example, sympathy with QAnon views. Talk to us a little bit about some of these beliefs and how strong they are among white Christian nationalists.
Well, of course, these views come along with a whole basket of other attitudes, and the ones that we find, and it is when you see it as a package, you realize like, oh, I recognize this, and it is quite disturbing. So the things that we find, just generally speaking, that positively correlate with Christian nationalism in the country are a denial of systemic racism, that even is a thing or exists, that past discrimination, denial that past discrimination has any effect on the present, strong anti-immigrant attitudes across the board, strong anti-Muslim attitudes, anti-Semitic attitudes, and patriarchal attitudes. Like all of these things are very positively associated with Trump. But to the two that sorry, with Christian nationalism and the MAGA movement, but the two that you asked about, QAnon and political violence, I think are really important because of, we've just seen with the kind of pardoning of the January 6th insurrectionists and the just general chaos that's happening in the government today. So we had two different questions, and part of the kind of fundamental things of QAnon is this kind of belief in apocalyptic revolution. And so there is this idea, and we formed it in a question this way: there's a storm coming soon that will sweep away the elites in power and restore the rightful leaders. So we hear that language all along, right? It's corrupt. It's and this is restoring the rightful thing, and this kind of just sweep it all away, burn it all down. And what we find is that Christian nationalists are far more likely to agree with that sentiment than those who lean away from it. In fact, it's a majority of those who are Christian nationalist adherents who agree with this idea, this of apocalyptic revolution. And even if we take it one step further, not just kind of revolution and like maybe taking over institutions the way we're seeing, but if we see political violence itself, as we saw on January 6th, that we find far more people who are adhere to Christian nationalism willing to say that because things have gotten so far off track, true American patriots may have to resort to violence in order to save the country. It's nearly 4 in 10 Christian nationalism adherents who agree with that statement. Now, think about that for a minute. That's 4 in 10, right, who say that we may just have to resort to violence in order to save the country. And that is justified in that worldview.
The plethora of edicts and decrees and actions that the Trump folks have enacted, there are a number of elements which seem to line up with some of these beliefs. This war on what they call DEI, which often amounts to blaming women and non-whites for things like an airplane crash, which there's no evidence whatsoever that that's the case, or orders involving trans Americans. Talk to us a little bit about how much of this philosophy you see in the orders, and whether, in fact, they're making progress towards a kind of Christian theocracy.
Well, I think one of the things that, it wasn't lost on you. I think you and I actually talked about this, but Project 2025 is through and through a Christian nationalist document. I think that's been missed by a lot of the kind of legacy media out there. I mean, they talk about it as an authoritarian document, expanding the authority of the executive, and all of that is true. But it is through and through, like people kind of miss somehow that Project 2025 calls for there being a national Christian Sabbath recognized by the government. Like that's in Project 2025. It calls for making the Department of Health and Human Services, renaming it the Department of Life as in pro-life, as in anti-abortion sentiments, right? In a country, by the way, where two-thirds of the country supports abortion rights today, right? And it is absolutely a vision of this kind of, again, a kind of ethno-religious dominance of white Christians in the country, where everyone else comes second class. And just historically speaking, I should just point out, we also are hearing America first. We hear that phrase a lot, right, from this crowd. That has always, always, always been wrapped up with this ethno-religious dominance in U.S. history, where it is white Anglo-Saxon Protestant Christians that are the rightful people controlling the country. We're seeing that through the nominee we've seen this. It was Hegseth's nomination, who literally has Christian Crusader tattoos on his arms and chest, right, and has written a lot about reviving the Christian Crusades. Like, sees that as a positive thing for the country, and now he's head of TOD.
My word. So we could have leaders in the Senate who reject these people. So far, the courts have been active in opposing many of these and freezing many of these Trumpian edicts. What can the country at large do when they see this rising philosophy that is so at odds with the central creed, all men are created equal, and this idea of a pluralistic democracy? What can average people do?
Well, I think we've all got to remember, and I count myself in these numbers, right? That even among religious Americans, this is not the majority view. Right? In fact, there are only two religious groups in the country that hold, among whom a majority hold Christian nationalist views, and those are white evangelical Protestants and Latino Protestants, both strong supporters of the MAGA movement and Trump. But every other religious group, including other Christian groups in the country, do not support this. So I think what we've got to do is remember Christian nationalists in this country are outnumbered 2 to 1 in the population. So we've got to be loud. We've got to speak up. And we're seeing the beginnings of this. What I've kind of called the sermon heard around the world by Bishop Marianne Budde was a prime example of this, speaking directly out of her own Episcopalian tradition about the values of mercy, right, and the role of that in that we should expect in our leaders. The Quakers here in Maryland have filed suit saying that ICE officials showing up at sensitive locations like churches violates their religious liberty and their ability to hold a religious service that is safe and where people feel like they can come and be at peace, right, and worship. So I think we're beginning to see, the kind of rumblings of this. But I think on the whole, the majority here, and we might even like pull a term back up from the 1980s. There's a different moral majority, a different religious majority on this front, and it's not the Christian nationalists.
And I would point out, I went back and I had to search a little bit for it because the legacy media wasn't covering it. But in addition to the bishop, we had statements from the Catholic bishops, not exactly a progressive group that was speaking out on immigration, the Lutherans, who are very involved in the resettlement of asylum seekers and other immigrants. So there was a response from, if you will, mainstream religious leaders and the like. How important is it for them to reestablish what I might call traditional Christian values of care for the poor, humility, kindness, honesty, welcoming the stranger? How important is that to boost up those values so they're not replaced by this sense of power and resentment and really bigotry?
Yeah, well, I mean, what we have in much of Christian nationalism is a replacement of the, values of Jesus with Machiavelli, right? And so I think this alternative vision, which is much more biblically grounded, much more in the center of Christian tradition, is so important. And I think that's why, like Bishop Budde's book, for example, which by the way is called How to Be Brave, is like out of stock, right? And I think it tells us like there is such a hunger, I think, by Christians, right? Even in
Yes.
the country, for leaders to say, "Hey, no, that's not us. That's not our tradition. It's certainly not the best of our." And I want to be clear. I mean that is part of the tradition, but it's not the best of the
Right.
tradition. And to stand up and claim these other values, and the one that I think is so heartbreaking to me is that the agency that has been so under attack and under attack first is USAID, right? This is the largest humanitarian effort in the world that the United States has stood up, and that's something we ought to be like hugely proud of. Like, we keep people from starving, we keep people from dying of HIV/AIDS, right, all around the world. And this is the thing that went under attack first, and this ought to be a layup, right, for Christians around the country to say, like, look. This is about compassion. It's about feeding the hungry. I mean, you could read this literally out of those red letters in the New Testament, right, of Jesus speaking.
I want to go back and pick up on something you said because I think a lot of the political analysis has missed this. And you noted that one of the groups that shows a majority of white Christian nationalists are Latino Protestants. We have seen a rise in Latino support for the Republican Party. Is it that group that has been shifting Republican as opposed to Catholic Latinos or Latinos of other or no religious background?
That's a great, really important question. I think you're right that I think people have focused on parsing the Latino vote in all kinds of ways. But one of the strongest divides in the Latino community is actually by religious tradition. Exactly what we do see is that historically, and this was true in this election as well, that Latino Protestants have tended to support Trump. In this election, as in every time Trump's been on the ballot, they voted about 6 and 10 for Trump. So they're not voting 8 and 10 the way that white evangelicals are. But this group is largely evangelical, charismatic, Pentecostal. So they're kind of theological cousins to the white evangelical movement. And I think there's a lot of affinity for also not only for the theology, but for the politics among Latino Protestants. Latino Catholics are in a very different place. In fact,
Yeah.
they have always leaned Democratic here, and that they sort of Harris lost some ground there too, but nowhere near. They still voted majority for Harris, according to our post-election poll at PRRI, as they have in the past. And Latino, the one that never gets any play is Latinos who are unaffiliated, who have not claimed any religious affiliation, and there are as many of them as there are Latino Protestants,
Wow.
right? And so paying attention to them, and they lean heavily Democratic as well. So it's a very complex picture by religion, and I think that's something we really have to understand if you're really going to understand the Latino vote in the country.
Absolutely. I want to leave our audience with something a little bit more positive because much of this is very disturbing. You have followed in your writings movements out there in the country, which are localized or ground
Mm.
up movements to try to expose, understand, make amends for some of the great racial, ethnic tragedies and outrages. Talk a little bit about how local communities are
Mm.
reestablishing those values of inclusion, of truth, and maybe that's a large part of the answer is bottom up.
Well, I think that's right, and it's going to be even more important when we have these attacks on DEI, attacks on critical race theory from the top, pushing down. But so in my book, just out last year, The Hidden Roots of White Supremacy and the Path to a Shared American Future, the second part of that title was about looking at local communities here. And I didn't go to the liberal New Englandy, I wasn't in Boston, I wasn't in New York. So I went to Tulsa, Oklahoma, I went to the Mississippi Delta, and I went to Duluth, Minnesota to look. So these are not bastions of liberalism by any chance. And yet, what I found was people on the ground trying to tell the truth about our complicated history, particularly around race, racial discrimination, slavery, segregation, even lynching, very difficult history, and yet realizing black and white across these lines that they needed to tell the truth that they were going to enter and hand to their kid, enter in a different phase of history for themselves and hand their kids a better future. That was what was motivating so many of them. So, just a couple of quick examples. In Mississippi, a group of people who were in Tallahatchie County, very rural county, is the place where Emmett Till was killed, right? And trying to deal with that legacy. And these were the descendants of plantation owners and the descendants of enslaved people and sharecroppers. Very small place, so they all know their own all that complicated family history, and yet they were meeting over the course of years to try to come to a place where they could tell the truth about what happened in their community, provide some healing, and move forward together. And I think that was a huge step. Oklahoma, we probably know that story, the Tulsa Race Massacre. But again, people across lines of race trying to tell the truth about that story, and they're also trying to tell the story about what happened to the Osage Native Americans in that community as well. Again, so there's not this secrecy, there's not the lying or obfuscation about the history, but really ways of thinking about, so where do we go from here, and how can we go somewhere together from here that has to do with justice and community and love and all these other things that again are a broader part of our the best of our religious tradition. So I am hope when I try to think about like in these days, where do I find hope? It is remembering that beyond all the bluster at the national level, down in local communities, there are still people of goodwill trying hard to tell the truth, to kind of heal from some of the kind of rifts in the past and try to build a better community to go forward together.
Thank you for that message. Thank you for all the work you do. It is fascinating. It's important. And I think it helps recalibrate ourselves. I think people see, because it's in the news and because it's very important, that this other view of America is winning. And they may have a temporary lock on government. But as you point out, the majority is still we, the people, is still a body of people that believe in a pluralistic democracy. And I keep hoping that next year, which is the 250th anniversary of the
Yeah.
Declaration of Independence, all men are created equal, will find a resurgence, and we'll get back to our very pluralistic, very American roots. So thanks for being with us. I'm sure we'll have you
Amen.
back again.
All right. Thanks, Jen.